A deafening blast echoed. The classroom door shattered. Children fell to the ground. Screams. Then silence. Blood spread across the hallway. In the midst of lifeless bodies, a young man walked slowly. His eyes were void of emotion. In his hand, an AR-15. Still hot. Valentine's Day had become a day of destruction. That was Nikolas Cruz, 20 years old. And what you're about to hear is not just a school shooting. This is a psychological case. Philia long descent into darkness. Let us reconstruct it together. At approximately 2:21 p.m. on the 14th of February, 2018, law enforcement received the first emergency call from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Broward County, Florida. Surveillance footage recorded a young male entering Building 12 of the school premises with a black duffel bag. Within minutes, sustained automatic gunfire was heard. Witnesses later described bodies slumped in corridors, pooling blood along stairwells, and victims attempting to flee before collapsing. The shooting continued for 6 minutes. 17 individuals were killed, and 17 others sustained serious injuries. The shooter was identified as Nikolas Jacob Cruz, a 19-year-old former student expelled from the same institution 1 year prior. He had used an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle. The weapon was legally purchased from a licensed dealer in Coral Springs, Florida. He carried multiple magazines and wore a maroon shirt, consistent with school colors, aiding in his temporary evasion of identification during the initial chaos. Forensic examination of the scene showed no forced entry or structural damage, indicating access was gained through open, unsecured pathways. The spatial distribution of victims across multiple floors, with no clear pattern of target selection, suggests indiscriminate intent. Most victims were shot at close range, consistent with tactical knowledge of confined indoor environments. Behavioral analysis of surveillance footage indicates calculated movement. Cruz navigated the hallways with familiarity, reloaded during movement, and avoided prolonged exposure near windows. This behavior indicates prior environmental reconnaissance and a baseline understanding of the building's layout, acquired during his enrollment or through independent re-entry prior to the attack. Eyewitness reports describe the assailant showing minimal verbal interaction. He did not issue threats or warnings, nor did he vocalize any ideological justification. This absence of expressive behavior suggests no performative motive at the point of execution. Instead, the actions reflect an internalized mission framework, likely premeditated without expectation of external audience or real-time affirmation. Following the assault, Cruz exited the building, blending with evacuating students. He proceeded on foot to a nearby commercial area, where he was apprehended approximately 40 minutes later. Upon arrest, he made statements implying auditory hallucinations and external compulsion. These claims were inconsistent with observed behavior before and during the shooting, and were not corroborated by psychological evaluations conducted post-custody. In subsequent police interviews, Cruz demonstrated fragmented narratives regarding motive, invoking themes of rejection and demonic influence. His affect was flat, with intermittent feigned distress. Attempts to portray psychological instability were undermined by incongruent nonverbal behavior, including self-inflicted gestures conducted only under visible surveillance. The attack occurred on Valentine's Day, a detail that later appeared in suspect statements as symbolic. However, no victim appeared to be specifically targeted based on prior relationship or grievance, reducing the likelihood of a personalized revenge motive. The absence of a manifesto or ideological alignment further complicates motive classification. The operational aspects of the incident, from weapon preparation to exit strategy, align more closely with premeditated mass violence than with reactive spree behavior. No suicide attempt followed the assault, and the subject made efforts to conceal his identity and weapon upon fleeing, suggesting cognitive control and intent to survive initial apprehension. The lack of immediate resistance within the school, combined with the rapid casualty rate, illustrates the effectiveness of weapon lethality within unprotected civilian settings. The shooter's ability to enter, kill, and escape before law enforcement arrived reflects systemic delay and inadequate preventative infrastructure. The psychological configuration remains partially unresolved. While narcissistic traits and attention-seeking behavior were evident in digital traces and pre-incident video diaries, the absence of coherent ideological or delusional fixation implies a hybrid pathology. The offender presented with antisocial behavioral markers, emotional detachment, and high-functioning manipulation, yet failed to sustain a consistent narrative when confronted with investigatory pressure. The discrepancy between the absence of verbal aggression during the assault and the later claims of demonic coercion introduces a contradiction not yet fully reconciled in the behavioral record. Further analysis is required to determine whether these inconsistencies reflect intentional deception, post-event rationalization, or disorganized thinking conditioned by chronic psychosocial instability. Nikolas Jacob Cruz was born on the 24th of September, 1998, in Margate, Florida. His biological mother had a documented history of criminal behavior and substance dependency. Due to her status as unfit for guardianship, Cruz was placed into the custody of Linda and Roger Cruz, an adoptive couple residing in Parkland. Records indicate no prior criminal history for the adoptive parents, and their household was classified as stable by child welfare services during early evaluations. Behavioral disturbances began to surface during early childhood. Reports from educational staff and mental health professionals indicate oppositional defiance, impulsivity, and social withdrawal before the age of 10. Cruz received multiple diagnoses, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and conduct disorder, both of which were managed intermittently through behavioral interventions and pharmacological treatment. Compliance with treatment protocols was inconsistent across institutions. By middle school, disciplinary records show a pattern of aggression toward peers and staff. Several instances involved physical altercations, verbal threats, and destruction of property. These were met with suspension and referral to alternative learning environments. Instructors noted his fascination with firearms, military paraphernalia, and violent media content. Observations of his sketchbooks revealed recurring imagery of weapons, explosions, and mutilation with no academic context or artistic assignment associated. From 2014 to 2017, Cruz engaged in multiple online forums centered around weaponry, tactical equipment, and extremist ideologies. While no direct affiliations with organized groups were confirmed, digital evidence later revealed that he posted threats under pseudonyms, expressed violent fantasies, and detailed hypothetical attacks. These behaviors were not reported to authorities in real time, indicating a lack of oversight or underestimation of threat level by platform moderators and users. The adoptive father, Roger Cruz, died in 2004 due to cardiac complications. His death coincided with an increase in behavioral volatility. Afterward, Linda Cruz became the sole guardian. Interviews with neighbors and family acquaintances indicated that her parenting style was permissive and she struggled to enforce boundaries. She permitted Cruz to access firearms through loosely monitored storage, despite awareness of his mental health profile. Firearms were reportedly acquired through legal means, facilitated in part by the lack of disqualifying records in national databases. In 2017, Linda Cruz died of pneumonia. At the time, Cruz was 19 and without legal guardianship. He moved between temporary residences, including staying with acquaintances of his deceased mother. During this period, there was a noticeable deterioration in hygiene, social function, and emotional regulation. Surveillance of his digital activity shows an escalation in both frequency and severity of violent rhetoric. Statements included fantasies of school shootings, racial animus, and nihilistic declarations. He began stockpiling ammunition, researching tactical strategies, and maintaining notebooks with kill lists and casualty projections. Broward County School District records document 67 disciplinary incidents involving Cruz. These include threats to students, assault on staff, and possession of contraband. He was transferred between several alternative education programs but failed to maintain stability or meet behavioral improvement benchmarks. Psychological evaluations flagged him as high risk, yet no formal action was taken to restrict his firearm access. Behavioral interventions were fragmented across institutions, and coordination between mental health services and law enforcement was insufficient to establish a prevention protocol. The removal from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School occurred in 2017 due to escalating threats of violence. However, there is no record of follow-up by school resource officers or mental health caseworkers post-expulsion. During this period, Cruz made multiple online declarations expressing resentment toward the school and its students. He returned to the location on several occasions without authorization. These entries were not reported or documented, suggesting a procedural gap in campus security measures. The subject's interest in violence was not confined to digital spaces. Interviews and affidavits reveal he frequently harmed animals, shot at neighborhood wildlife, and showed no empathy when confronted. These behaviors are consistent with early indicators of psychopathy. He demonstrated a pattern of cruelty devoid of remorse and often shared these experiences with peers as a form of boasting. Attempts by peers and family acquaintances to report his behavior to law enforcement resulted in at least 45 documented calls to the Broward County Sheriff's Office over a span of 8 years. These included explicit warnings that Cruz posed a danger to schools. The volume and specificity of these reports suggest a systemic failure to evaluate and escalate community-sourced intelligence. Despite multiple behavioral red flags, Cruz maintained eligibility to purchase firearms under existing Florida law. Psychological assessments failed to generate mandatory reporting thresholds, and he had no criminal convictions that would have triggered disqualifying entries in background check systems. This regulatory vacuum allowed for the accumulation of weapons and planning materials without external interference. The trajectory from early conduct disturbances to operational planning of mass violence reflects a convergence of untreated pathology, environmental instability, and institutional inaction. While certain risk factors were individually identified, the absence of integrated threat assessment prevented effective intervention. The continuity of antisocial behavior, combined with the operational intent demonstrated during the assault, suggests a developmental arc consistent with violent ideation that evolved into executable strategy. However, the role of performative manipulation and false narrative construction in his post-arrest behavior requires further differentiation between pathological belief and calculated deception. Nikolas Jacob Cruz exhibited a behavioral profile consistent with multiple co-occurring psychological conditions, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, and traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder. These patterns were documented in educational, psychiatric, and judicial records spanning over a decade. However, the extent to which each diagnosis contributed to the operational planning and execution of the attack remains subject to interdisciplinary evaluation. ADHD in Cruz manifested primarily through impulsivity, difficulty with sustained attention, and chronic restlessness. In institutional settings, this resulted in consistent academic underperformance and frequent classroom disruptions. These symptoms were treated pharmacologically during early adolescence, but were often discontinued without medical supervision, leading to behavioral destabilization. While ADHD alone does not correlate with violence, its presence may exacerbate dysregulation when combined with antisocial tendencies and environmental instability. ODD symptoms in Cruz presented as persistent defiance toward authority figures, frequent verbal hostility, and deliberate provocation. Reports indicate habitual non-compliance with school directives, disregard for rules, and repeated confrontation with teachers and administrators. These oppositional behaviors were not situational or reactive, but appeared generalized across social settings. The chronicity of such conduct suggested entrenched resistance to external control structures, increasing the risk of escalated conflict under stress or rejection. Features of narcissistic personality disorder were more evident in digital behavior and post-incident interviews. Cruz repeatedly expressed the belief that he had been wronged, misunderstood, or ignored by society. He produced videos in which he described future violence as a means of achieving recognition. These recordings lacked ideological substance and instead focused on personal validation through infamy. This behavior indicates compensatory grandiosity, where perceived social exclusion is reframed as superiority deserving of acknowledgement through destructive means. The convergence of these conditions became more operational during the months preceding the attack. Cruz began to isolate socially while increasing his consumption of violent content. Search histories included school shooting blueprints, body count comparisons, and tactical firearm usage. He created structured plans, listing intended targets, escape routes, and timing sequences. The methodical nature of these preparations demonstrates functional cognition and an ability to delay gratification in pursuit of a goal. The presence of premeditation, coupled with the absence of a coherent political or religious ideology, supports classification under expressive mass violence rather than instrumental terrorism. His stated justifications were vague, often invoking abstract resentment or references to internal voices. However, these rationales lacked consistency and changed across interviews. When questioned by law enforcement, Cruz claimed auditory hallucinations directing him to commit violence. Forensic evaluation failed to confirm the presence of psychosis, and his responses were incongruent with typical schizophrenic symptomology. Self-harming gestures observed during initial detainment were temporally aligned with surveillance visibility. These behaviors ceased once officers exited the room or cameras were turned off. This pattern indicates behavioral staging rather than genuine dissociation or loss of reality testing. Statements made during psychological assessment further reveal an awareness of criminality and a basic understanding of consequences. He expressed hope for public attention, referencing other high-profile attackers and expressing dissatisfaction at the perceived lack of acknowledgement following the shooting. The attempt to simulate psychosis post-arrest, including references to demonic voices and spiritual possession, was undermined by inconsistencies in timing, content, and affective display. The narrative changed across sessions and failed to align with observable pre-attack behavior. No evidence suggests disorganized thinking or perceptual distortion during the planning or execution stages. His motor behavior, speech cadence, and spatial orientation during the assault reflect deliberate control and situational awareness. The behavioral shift from generalized aggression to targeted mass violence was not spontaneous. Cruz accumulated weapons, conducted research, and rehearsed operational elements. He maintained secrecy, avoided discussion of plans with peers, and expressed intention to survive the event. This evidences both executive functioning and capacity for future-oriented planning, characteristics inconsistent with acute psychosis or temporary mental defect. No major emotional breakdown was observed before or after the shooting. Witness accounts and interrogative transcripts show a restricted affect with limited empathy for victims or recognition of moral transgression. Emotional flatness persisted throughout the trial process. When questioned about motivation, he often redirected attention to his own discomfort or grievances, reinforcing narcissistic traits rather than genuine remorse. The combination of manipulative posturing, strategic planning, and lack of emotional resonance suggests a personality structure grounded in self-referential justification and externalization of blame. While ADHD and ODD may have contributed to long-term social maladjustment, the operational decision to conduct mass violence requires additional explanation beyond these diagnoses. Further analysis is required to determine the extent to which Cruz's fabricated narratives influence forensic evaluation and whether such behavior reflects calculated manipulation or maladaptive coping strategies rooted in chronic identity instability. Between 2008 and 2018, at least 45 documented reports regarding Nikolas Jacob Cruz were submitted to various local authorities, educational institutions, and mental health entities. These reports included concerns related to threats of violence, animal cruelty, possession of weapons, and explicit statements referencing school shootings. A review of these submissions reveals a consistent pattern of fragmentation in institutional response, resulting in a failure to initiate coordinated intervention or risk mitigation. Calls to the Broward County Sheriff's Office began as early as 2010. Multiple individuals, including neighbors, classmates, and school personnel, provided specific descriptions of Cruz's behavior. These included the mutilation of animals, threats against students and teachers, and statements about becoming a school shooter. In several cases, the reports contained names, addresses, and first-hand witness accounts. Despite this, many were categorized as non-actionable due to insufficient immediate threat or lack of corroborating evidence at the time of response. The pattern of delay suggests intentional suppression of reporting urgency or misinterpretation of procedural thresholds for intervention. Internal records show that officers responding to calls involving Cruz often closed incidents without escalation. citing mental health concerns as a civil matter outside the scope of law enforcement unless an immediate threat was present. This classification prevented further engagement under criminal statutes or red flag provisions. Institutional overlap contributed to systemic paralysis. Broward County Public Schools maintained separate records documenting Cruz's disciplinary infractions and psychological evaluations. These were not consistently shared with law enforcement or social services. Likewise, the Department of Children and Families conducted at least one formal investigation but concluded that Cruz did not meet the criteria for involuntary psychiatric commitment under the Baker Act. This determination was based on interviews that did not fully account for the totality of his documented behavior across multiple domains. The behavioral data collected by the school system included aggressive outbursts, expressions of homicidal ideation, and repeated references to firearms. Despite this, Cruz remained in possession of legally acquired weapons. Florida law at the time did not require mandatory reporting from school officials to firearms databases. Unless adjudication of mental incompetence had occurred through a court, no such adjudication was pursued. Online activity presented additional missed opportunities. In September 2017, a YouTube user with the same name commented, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." This was reported to the Federal Bureau of Investigation by the content creator who discovered the comment. The agency acknowledged receipt but failed to identify the individual or initiate a field investigation. Later, internal review revealed that the lead was labeled as non-specific and archived without coordination with local agencies. Social services were inconsistently applied and largely voluntary. Mental health referrals for Cruz were made through school channels, but attendance at treatment sessions was irregular. Monitoring mechanisms for follow-up compliance were absent. Without judicial mandate, there was no mechanism to enforce psychiatric evaluation or maintain treatment continuity. These structural deficiencies allowed symptoms to escalate without external regulation. Post-incident analysis revealed that Cruz had passed multiple background checks when purchasing firearms. His record lacked disqualifying entries, largely because no institution initiated the legal proceedings necessary to flag him under existing firearm prohibition laws. The absence of criminal convictions or court-ordered psychiatric holds preserved his eligibility. This condition illustrates a critical gap between observable behavioral risk and legal classification of dangerousness. Administrative culture within law enforcement and school systems emphasized short-term incident resolution rather than longitudinal threat assessment. Officers treated Cruz's behavior as isolated disturbances rather than components of an escalating trajectory. This segmentation of events across years and institutions produced an illusion of unrelated episodes, despite overlapping content and growing severity. Institutional actors operated within a reactive framework, waiting for imminent threat signals rather than proactively addressing cumulative indicators. Training materials used by school officials and law enforcement focused on de-escalation and behavioral management, but did not include mechanisms for interagency data consolidation or threat modeling. This deficiency hindered the development of a coherent behavioral profile before the attack occurred. Community response to Cruz's behavior also reflected systemic fatigue and normalization. Repeated incidents led to a desensitized perception among peers and neighbors, many of whom admitted post-incident that they had grown to expect instability but no longer believed intervention was likely. This group resignation further diluted the potential impact of individual warnings. The operational pathway leading to the shooting was not concealed. It was surrounded by observable indicators, recorded warnings, and repeated expressions of intent. The inability of public institutions to synthesize these signals into actionable intervention represents a structural failure in threat prevention protocols. Further analysis is needed to determine whether the observed institutional inaction was the result of procedural gaps, liability aversion, or cognitive fatigue among personnel repeatedly exposed to low-level disturbances. This evaluation may clarify how systemic desensitization and procedural compartmentalization intersect to undermine early threat detection. The sentencing phase of State of Florida versus Nikolas Jacob Cruz concluded on the 2nd of November 2022 with the imposition of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The decision followed a lengthy penalty trial in which the jury recommended life imprisonment rather than capital punishment. This recommendation, issued despite unanimous findings of aggravating factors, including premeditation, mass casualty, and vulnerability of victims, highlighted procedural complexities in capital sentencing under Florida law, which at the time required unanimity for a death verdict. The courtroom proceedings featured numerous victim impact statements, many of which were delivered by surviving relatives and classmates. Among them was a statement from a former classmate and the girlfriend of one of the deceased victims. Her testimony, while not exculpatory, included language recognizing the humanity of the defendant, while simultaneously affirming the emotional void created by the loss. This expression was interpreted by some observers as indicative of post-traumatic resilience, while others cited it as an illustration of moral conflict when confronting acts of extreme violence within a juvenile perpetrator. This behavior indicates the emergence of a survivor identity framework in certain victims' associates, in which processing trauma involves acknowledgement of the offender's humanity without equating it to forgiveness. Such statements did not mitigate the procedural outcome, but introduced a socio-psychological dimension to the discourse surrounding restorative versus retributive justice. The emotional neutrality displayed by the defendant during these statements remained consistent with prior behavioral observations, suggesting either limited empathetic capacity or deliberate affective suppression. The judicial outcome reflected legal finality, but did not resolve broader societal questions about culpability, prevention, and institutional accountability. The life sentence structurally removed the offender from public circulation without granting symbolic closure typically associated with capital punishment. This may contribute to extended psychological latency in affected communities, where a lack of perceived ultimate justice becomes a barrier to collective recovery. Post-sentencing reports indicated no observable remorse from the defendant. In correctional settings, Cruz exhibited periodic disciplinary violations, including aggression towards staff and non-compliance with institutional routines. These actions reflect a persistent pattern of oppositional behavior under authority and reinforce diagnostic markers previously documented during the pre-incident phase. His written communications from confinement continued to emphasize self-image and victimhood, indicating unresolved narcissistic traits rather than rehabilitative orientation. The role of community response during and after the trial was characterized by dual narratives. One faction emphasized punitive justice, citing the irreversibility of loss and the deliberate nature of the offense. Another, less dominant but present, engaged in discourse concerning the limitations of the carceral model in cases involving early behavioral dysfunction and systemic neglect. These narratives coexist within a complex moral landscape shaped by grief, institutional failure, and divergent conceptions of justice. While the legal process met the threshold of procedural justice, the broader psychosocial aftermath remains unresolved. The defendant was legally an adult at the time of the offense, but his developmental trajectory was marked by chronic dysfunction and unaddressed psychiatric distress. The court's decision to forego the death penalty may reflect an implicit acknowledgement of this developmental ambiguity, though such considerations were not formally determinative under statutory guidelines. The case illustrates a tension between clinical diagnosis and legal classification. Behavioral indicators consistent with antisocial conduct and narcissistic pathology were evident throughout the preparatory, operational, and post-offense phases. However, these traits do not reach the threshold of legal insanity and therefore do not absolve responsibility under criminal law. The convergence of volitional capacity, structured planning, and cognitive coherence confirms criminal liability while leaving unresolved the question of moral comprehension. The Parkland case remains a reference point in the ongoing analysis of institutional accountability, juvenile adjudication in mass violence, and the limitations of preemptive intervention models. It demonstrates how observable risk behaviors, when left unintegrated across institutional channels, can culminate in high-casualty events that challenge the operational thresholds of threat detection and legal culpability. The long-term implications include sustained psychological trauma within the affected school community, reevaluation of school resource officer policies, and legislative adjustments concerning red flag laws and background checks. However, no single policy shift addresses the core behavioral discontinuity between early warning and preemptive containment. The case therefore underscores the necessity of integrated behavioral threat assessment models, particularly when dealing with juveniles exhibiting escalating violence indicators. The defendant's imprisonment marks the cessation of physical threat, but does not equate to psychological closure. Survivors remain engaged in a process of reconstruction that varies in duration and form. Institutional systems involved in the pre-incident timeline continue to undergo scrutiny and, in some jurisdictions, reform. The integration of mental health profiling into early education systems remains under development, with debates surrounding ethical, legal, and operational boundaries. What are your thoughts on the behavioral conclusions presented here? Do you agree with this interpretation, or would you classify it differently?